Fern Hale was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, and carrying a tray of champagne across a Chicago ballroom where every guest had paid $15,000 just to sit down. She'd buried her husband 14 months earlier. She was still paying off the hospital bills that killed him twice, once with cancer, and once with paperwork. So she worked. Double shifts, catering gigs, anything that didn't ask questions about the belly straining against her borrowed uniform. That night she only needed to get through 4 more hours without anyone noticing her. Vivian Ashford noticed. The heiress stepped into her path, wrinkled her nose, and said it loud enough for the nearest tables to hear that people don't pay $15,000 a plate to smell whatever Fern had brought in with her. The tray went down, glass everywhere, and while Fern knelt on the marble, picking up the pieces with a child kicking under her ribs, Vivian looked down at her and added, "Belly out to here," and she's still hauling trays. I doubt she even knows who the father is. 200 people laughed. Phones came up. Nobody helped her. Then a chair scraped across the floor at the back of the room, and the laughter died in stages, table by table, because the man getting to his feet was Edward Ravello, 37 years old, head of the Ravello family, a man most of those guests had spent the whole evening pretending not to look at. He crossed that ballroom without hurrying. He didn't say a single word to Vivian. He took Fern's hand, helped her up off the floor, and he kissed her in front of every camera in the room. Not one of those 200 people understood why. Neither did she. If a story like this means something to you, take a second to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that ballroom in Chicago, to the moment the laughter stopped, and everything Fern Hale believed about her own child started coming apart. Nobody applauded. For 3 full seconds, the ballroom of the Warwick Hotel made no sound at all. And in that silence, Fern Hale became aware of small things she would remember for the rest of her life. The string quartet gone quiet without anyone telling it to stop. A server frozen in the aisle with a bottle of wine still tilted in his hand. A fork slipping off somebody's plate and ringing against the china like a gunshot. Her hand was still warm where his had held it. She couldn't remember standing up. Edward Ravello let go of her, and he didn't look at her, and he didn't look at the floor where she'd been kneeling. He turned instead to face 200 people who had been laughing 11 seconds earlier, and he said one sentence. "Anyone who touches her, touches me." He didn't raise his voice. He said it the way a man reads out a phone number, plainly, without heat, and it traveled the length of that room and slid underneath every white linen tablecloth, and not one person in 200 so much as cleared his throat. The phones began coming down, one at a time, then all at once. A man in the 3rd row slipped his into his jacket pocket the way a boy hides something he's been caught with. Vivian Ashford stood less than 6 feet away. She opened her mouth. She closed it. The color went out of her face so fast that her powder turned chalk white under the chandeliers, and the man who'd come in on her arm took half a step backward, discreetly, but far enough that everyone watching understood he'd just removed himself from her. Edward never once looked at her, and at the head table, raised 3 steps above the floor, Harlan Ashford set down his glass. 61 years old, chairman of the foundation whose name was printed on every program in that room. A man who had cut the ribbon 15 minutes earlier and been applauded twice for it. He didn't stand. He showed no anger that his own daughter had just been publicly gutted in front of everyone who mattered in Chicago. He simply looked at Edward Ravello, and Edward Ravello looked back. 3 seconds. Nobody else in that ballroom noticed, because they were all still busy staring at the waitress. But those 2 men held each other's eyes for 3 seconds, and something passed between them in that time. Something that had no words attached to it. Something Fern wouldn't understand for another 7 weeks. Then Harlan nodded. A small nod. The nod of a man receiving confirmation of a thing he had already worked out for himself. Edward turned away. He led her out through the side doors, past 2 security men standing like statuary, and Fern followed because her legs were carrying her, not because she'd decided anything. Her shift supervisor came after them for 3 steps, and then stopped dead in the middle of the corridor, and didn't come any farther. Out in the lobby, under a chandelier that must have weighed a ton, Fern pulled her hand free. "That's enough." He stopped. He turned around with both hands in his pockets, and he waited. She was breathing too fast. The baby kicked hard, up under her ribs, at the exact moment she most needed to stand up straight, and she put a hand there and made her voice hold. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. "I don't know you. You don't know me." You just kissed me in front of 200 phones. She heard her voice crack on the last word and hated herself for it. Do you have any idea what my life turns into tomorrow morning? Yes. One word. No apology attached to it. No explanation behind it. Fern stood there looking at him. She had been braced for something else entirely. For an excuse. For a joke. For the particular kind of pity she'd learned to recognize in the first half-second of a stranger's face. And she had an answer ready for all three. She had nothing at all for a man who simply said yes. Then why? Something moved across his face, very quickly. It wasn't guilt. It looked closer to exhaustion. You wouldn't believe me if I told you tonight. Try me. Not tonight. He took a card out of his coat and set it down on the concierge counter beside her, rather than putting it into her hand. When you want to know, you call. Beyond the glass doors, a black sedan had already drawn up tight against the curb. A man got out and opened the rear door and stood waiting in the cold. Let me have you driven home. No. It's below 0 out there. I said no. She picked her bag up off the bench. I've been taking the bus for 6 months. Tonight isn't any different. She walked past the card without touching it. 3 steps on, she stopped and turned her head. You never asked my name. Edward Ravello stood in the middle of that hotel lobby, and for the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. Fern pushed through the doors and went out into the wind. She walked 2 blocks to the stop for the number 42, and sat down on the cold plastic bench beside 3 strangers who never once looked up. In her coat pocket, her phone buzzed. Then it wouldn't stop. She didn't take it out. The bus came at 11:20, and she rode it home with her forehead against the freezing glass and her eyes shut. The black sedan followed that bus for 40 minutes. The kitchen light was still burning when Fern let herself into the second-floor apartment on Emerald Street. Walter Hale sat in the chair by the window with 2 needles in his hands and a half-finished wool cap resting in his lap. 68 years old, and still keeping the one habit she'd told him 100 times to give up. It's near 1, he said, without looking up from the stitch. You should be asleep. I was waiting on you. She hung her coat on the hook, went to the sink, poured herself a glass of water. She got half of it down before she had to set it on the counter, because her hand wouldn't hold steady. The needles stopped. What's wrong with your hands? I stood for 6 hours. Fern. She turned and looked at him. Then she told him. 4 sentences, no more than that, and she left out the worst of it. Walter sat very still. He laid the needles down, folded the wool cap over once, and set it on the arm of the chair. Who is he? I don't know. A man put his hands on you and you don't know who he is. I asked him. He wouldn't say. She pulled a chair out and lowered herself into it, one hand under her belly. He left a card. I didn't take it. In the coat on the hook, her phone buzzed. 3 times, then quiet, then again. Walter looked toward it. That's been going since you walked in. I know. You're not going to look. No. He didn't press her. That was the thing she was most grateful for in that man. He always knew exactly where to stop. On the table, between his blood pressure box and her stack of time cards, there was a fresh envelope with red printing in the corner. She'd seen it the second she came through the door. Came this afternoon, Walter said. I know. I didn't open it. Wouldn't have changed anything. She pushed it aside with 2 fingers. $180,000. The hospital sold it off to 3 different collection outfits, and every one of them says the other 2 are the ones I ought to be talking to. I've still got the savings. You've got $6,400 and you need it to live on. Walter went quiet. Then he said the thing he'd been saying late at night for 14 months, very softly. If Daniel were still here, it would be exactly the same, Dad. She didn't say it sharply. Acute leukemia doesn't wait on anybody. 4 rounds of chemo. They told us 10%, and I remember the exact day they brought it down to 2. 14 months. 14 months and 10 days. He nodded. He was always the more accurate one about that. Fern put a hand flat on her belly. The baby was turning over slow and heavy, the way they do at 32 weeks. You remember the day he went in to bank it? She said. I drove him. The doctor said it had to be before the first round or there'd be nothing left to save. He argued the whole way there. She laughed once, very short. Said he was going to beat it anyway, and doing that was bad luck. Then he went in and signed the papers. He signed them for you. I know. Walter looked at her belly and then he looked away. I told you not to do it, he said. You told me to wait. I told you that you were 27 years old. I told you that you had your whole life ahead of you and that you were buried in debt already. There was no reproach anywhere in his voice. I still think it. I know you do. Fern raised her eyes. But I didn't do it for Daniel, Dad. Everybody thinks I did it for Daniel. The clinic thought so too. I could see it on their faces. Then what did you do it for? For me. She said it without hesitating. I sat in that room 8 months ago and I thought, if I let that 1 year take every single thing I had, what exactly is left of me? So I signed. Walter picked up the wool cap, turned it over once in his hands, and put it back down. Go to bed, sweetheart. She slept about 3 hours. At 5 in the morning she reached for her phone, and she would spend a long time afterward wishing she hadn't. The clip ran 31 seconds. Somebody had shot it from table 7. The frame tilted a little, but her face was clear from the first second to the last. By 6 it had 340,000 views. By 7, it was on the front page of 2 local news sites. Nobody knew her name. They were calling her the pregnant waitress. At 7:10, the staffing coordinator from the catering company rang her. We've all seen the clip. Yes, Fern. We're very sorry about what happened to you. Fern sat down on the edge of the bed. She had worked for that company 11 months, and this was the first time that woman had ever called her directly. But our clients are extremely sensitive about optics. She went on. We're going to pause you on the schedule. It isn't personal. Paused for how long? We'll be in touch. I'm losing my shifts because somebody humiliated me at work. We don't use the word losing, Fern. The line went dead. She sat still for 30 seconds. Then she opened her contacts and started dialing. 4 other places turned her down before that same day was over. 12 floors above the river, Edward Ravello stood at the window with his back to the room, while Tobias Kern read from a folder he hadn't been asked to bring. She lost the catering work at 7:10 this morning. Optics, they told her. She called 5 other agencies before noon. All 5 turned her down. Edward said nothing. The clips passed 2 million. Somebody's already selling a shirt with her face on it. Tobias closed the folder. She wouldn't take the card. No. She wouldn't take the car either. No. Tobias Kern was 49 years old and had worked for the Ravello family since he was 22. First for the father and then for the son, and in all that time he had learned exactly one thing about asking Edward questions, which was that you asked them once, and then you waited, sometimes for a very long while. Sir, I've been carrying that woman's file in and out of this office for 2 years, and I've never once asked you why. I know. I'm asking now. For a while, Edward didn't turn around, and it is 26 months earlier, and it is raining. There is an alley behind an all-night diner on Halsted Street, and a man is on the ground between a dumpster and a brick wall with his coat open and his hand pressed hard against his own side, and he is trying to work out how many minutes he has. The back door opens. A girl comes out with a bus tub of dishes on her hip, and she sees him, and she doesn't scream. That is the first thing he notices about her, that she doesn't scream. She sets the tub down on the wet asphalt. She kneels. She has a clean bar towel over her shoulder, and she folds it twice and puts it where his hand is, and she leans her whole weight into it, and she says, "Keep your hand on top of mine. Don't let up," he says. "Don't call anybody." She looks at him. She's young, no more than 25, wearing a paper hat she hasn't bothered to take off. She says, "You need an ambulance." He says, "Please." And she stays. That's the part he has never been able to put down. She doesn't leave, and she doesn't argue, and she doesn't ask him his name. Not once. Not in 20 minutes. She talks to him instead. About nothing. About the fryer that's been broken since March, and the manager who won't fix it. About how the rain always comes through the seam in her shoe first. And he understands after a while that she is talking, so he'll stay awake. And that she is doing it gently enough that he won't have to know that's what she's doing. Twice, she takes off her own jacket and puts it over him. When the headlights finally swing into the mouth of the alley, she stands up and steps back and she says, "They're here. You're all right now." 2 of his men come out fast. She lifts her hands off him and she doesn't ask them anything either. She looks down at what her uniform has become and she says, only to herself, that she has a shirt in her locker. Then she picks up the bus tub, because it is still sitting there in the rain, and she carries it back inside and finishes the dishes. And she works the rest of her shift and clocks out at 4 in the morning. She never told anyone. He had men watch that diner for 11 days waiting for her to sell it to somebody, to a reporter, to the police, to the other side, because in his experience that is what people do with a thing like that. They hold it until it's worth something. She never said a word to a living soul. Edward turned around from the window at last. "You want to know what she asked me for?" he said. In 20 minutes on her knees in the rain, with a man she'd never seen before bleeding on her hands, she asked me if I was warm enough. Tobias was quiet. "You've had that woman watched for 2 years," he said finally. "Over 20 minutes. Yes. Sir, with respect, half the men in this city would have sat down beside you in that alley if they'd known who you were. That's the point." Edward crossed to the desk and put 2 fingers on the folder without opening. Every kindness I have received since I was 19 years old has been an invoice. Somebody kneels beside you, and they are already writing the number down in their head. She didn't know what I was worth. That's why it counted. And you never told her. No. 2 years. And you never once let her know who was standing behind her. If she'd known, Edward said, then it becomes something she's owed for. Then it becomes the same as everything else. Tobias let that sit. "She's out of work," he said. "She's 8 months along. She's got a sick old man in that apartment and a debt that would flatten a grown business. Whatever you thought you were protecting her from, sir, it's already inside the house." Edward looked down at the folder for a long moment. "I know," he said. "That's not what I've been protecting her from." And Tobias Kern, who had worked for that family for 27 years, felt the floor shift very slightly under him, because he'd just understood that his employer had been holding something back from him too. 2 months after the alley, on a gray Tuesday in February, Edward Ravello walked into the Lakeshore Fertility Institute on North Wells Street and signed his name at the front desk like any other man. The lawyers had put it to him in a single line. A man in his position who bleeds out behind a diner at 35 years old leaves certain instruments in his father's estate, unexercised, permanently, and there is no undoing that after the fact. So he did what the lawyers told him to do. He filled out the intake forms. He answered the questions about his family history, and where the answer was violence, he wrote none, because that is what the form was designed to accept. He gave 4 vials. They were logged, labeled, frozen in nitrogen, and assigned a 9-digit identifier that he never once looked at. He paid the storage fee annually by wire, the way a man pays for a safe deposit box he intends never to open, and for 24 months he did not think about it again. Then, 3 days before the Ashford Winter Gala, a letter came by courier to the 12th floor. It was 4 pages, on the stationery of a firm in the Loop that Lakeshore had evidently retained in a hurry, and it used the phrase specimen identification, incident, 9 separate times, without ever once using the word mistake. Tobias read it first. Then he read it again standing up. Then he brought it in and set it on the desk, and said nothing at all, which was not like him. The material portion was on page 2. In a paragraph, the lawyers had clearly written and rewritten. An intrauterine insemination procedure performed at the Institute 8 months prior had been carried out using a specimen drawn from storage under an identifier that did not correspond to the one on the patient's authorization. The donor of record was listed as Edward Ravello. The recipient of record was listed as Fern Hale. He read her name twice. Then he set the letter down and stood at the window for a long time with his hands behind his back, and Tobias, who had known him for 27 years, could not have told anybody what he was thinking. Everything after that was procedure. He had 2 separate firms verify the chain of custody, quietly, without contacting Lakeshore again. He had the woman's file pulled, the one that had been going in and out of that office for 2 years, and he read it from the first page. 27 years old, widowed 14 months, husband banked material at the same institute prior to chemotherapy, medical debt sold to 3 collection agencies, 1 dependent, a father-in-law, 68, hypertensive, no living parents, no siblings, no one at all, in other words, who would ever have standing to demand a test. He had the Institute's board and donor list pulled as well, and that took a day and a half, and when it came back, there was a name on the second page that he had known his whole adult life. Harlan Ashford, 6 years on the advisory board, 2 capital campaigns, a wing on the 3rd floor with his late wife's name on the door. Edward read that page for a long while, and then he put it face down on the desk and asked Tobias one question. "Is the Ashford Gala still Thursday?" That was the whole of his reason for going. He had not been to a charity dinner in 6 years, and there was no man in that ballroom who expected to see him at one. He went because he wanted to look at Harlan Ashford across a room, in public, with 200 witnesses between them, and see what happened in the man's face. And he went because he had been carrying a woman's file for 2 years and had never once seen her stand up in a room full of people, and he wanted to know what she was like when she thought no one important was watching. He arrived after the ribbon. He took a seat at the back, refused the wine, and spoke to nobody. He watched Harlan Ashford cut the ribbon and receive his applause and sit back down, and he watched the man's eyes travel over the room the way a landlord's do. And he watched the woman in the borrowed uniform work the far side of the floor for 40 minutes, carrying a tray with both hands because one wasn't enough anymore, resting for a moment against the service column between rounds with her palm flat on the small of her back, and then straightening up and going out again. Nothing that happened afterward was planned. He had come there to look at 2 people and to leave before dessert. What he had not accounted for, sitting at that back table with the file still in his head, was what it would do to him to watch 200 people laugh at her, and to see that not one of them stood up, and to know that of every person in that room, he was the only one who understood exactly what she was carrying. He put his napkin on the table. He got up. And of everything that man had done in his life, that was the one thing he had never once thought through before he did it. 6 days after the gala, Fern went back to nights at the diner on Halsted Street, because it was the only place in Chicago that would still put her name on a schedule. The manager had watched the clip like everybody else, and all he'd said about it was, "You're on 11 to 7, and she had been so grateful she'd had to turn around and face the coffee machine for a second. It was 2:15 in the morning when the bell over the door went, and Edward Ravello walked in. Alone. No car at the curb that she could see. No men behind him. He took the corner booth. He ordered coffee. She brought it, because she was the only one on the floor, and she set it down and said nothing and turned to go. "Sit down for a minute. I'm working. There's nobody in here. There's me." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the saucer without drinking from it. Then he took an envelope out of his coat and laid it flat on the table and slid it across the formica until it stopped in front of her. She didn't touch it. "What's that?" "It's not a gift, and it isn't a settlement. Look at it before you decide what it is." She looked. It was a check, and the number on it was large enough that she felt it in her knees, and she put both hands on the edge of the table and stood very still for a moment. "You've had somebody look into me," she said. "Yes. You know about the debt. Yes. You know how much my shifts pay, and you know about my father-in-law, and you know I'm 8 months along and can't get hired anywhere in this city. Yes. Then you know exactly what that piece of paper looks like to a woman like me at 2 in the morning." She pushed it back across the table with one finger, slowly, the whole width of the formica, until it was in front of him again. "I can't sell you my pity, and I'm not going to buy yours. It isn't pity. Everything's pity when it comes with a number on it." She picked up the coffee pot again. "There isn't a person alive who's ever handed me money without wanting to feel a certain way about themselves afterward. You want to be a decent man tonight, then be one. Drink your coffee. Leave the tip you'd leave anybody. Let me finish my shift." Edward looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He put the envelope back in his coat without another word. He drank the coffee. He left $4 under the cup, which was exactly right, and he went out and the bell rang over the door behind him, and Fern stood there with the pot in her hand and found that her eyes were stinging, and she could not have said why. At 4:20 the bell went again. Vivian Ashford came in out of the cold in a coat worth more than the building, and she looked around the diner once, at the cracked booth seats, and the pie case, and the fryer that had been broken since March, and every single thing she thought about it was on her face. She sat down in the same corner booth. Fern came over with the pot. "Coffee?" "No." Vivienne set her purse on the table. "I'm not going to say I'm sorry, so let's not waste each other's time on that. I didn't ask you to. You've been on television twice in 6 days. My father's foundation has had 11 donors go quiet on us. My engagement has been discussed by strangers on the internet approximately 40,000 times." She opened the purse. "So here's what I'm offering." She laid a check on the table. Fern didn't have to pick it up to read it. It was more than twice the other one. "That's not charity," Vivian said. "That's a transaction, and I expect you to treat it as one. You leave Chicago, not the neighborhood, the city. You don't talk to a reporter. You don't sign anything. You don't sell that clip. And you don't ever say the Ravello name and the Ashford name in the same sentence in public for as long as you live. Take it. Go have your baby somewhere warm and never think about any of us again." Fern set the coffee pot down on the table. She picked up the check with both hands, and she held it for a second, and she thought about $180,000, and a 68-year-old man's blood pressure pills, and a crib she had not been able to buy yet. Then she tore it in half. Then she put the halves together and tore them again, and let the pieces fall onto the formica in front of that woman. "The other man tonight offered me money because he thought I needed it," she said. "You're offering me money to make me disappear." He was insulting. "You're worse. You are going to regret that." "Probably." Fern picked the pot back up. "But I'll still be here in the morning, and I'll know what I'm worth. And you'll still be a woman who thought that could be settled with a checkbook at 4 a.m. Vivienne stood up. At the door she stopped and looked back. And she wasn't angry, which was somehow much worse. "You should have taken it," she said. "You have no idea what's already been decided about you." The call came at 2 hours past noon, while Fern was asleep after her shift, and she was awake and upright before the second ring finished. It was a neighbor from the first floor. Walter had gone down the outside stairs to get the mail, and the third step from the bottom had a patch of ice on it that had been there since December, and he was at St. Bridget Medical Center on the west side, and she should come now. He'd been lying at the bottom of those stairs for 11 minutes before anybody found him. The rest of that day went by in a way she would never be able to put back in order afterward. Fractured femoral neck, the surgeon said. 68 years old, hypertensive, on a blood thinner. They would operate in the morning. Then a woman from Patient Financial Services came down the hall with a clipboard and asked if Fern had a minute, and Fern understood that the day she'd been dreading had arrived on a schedule she hadn't chosen. They sat in a small room with 2 chairs and a box of tissues that Fern didn't touch. The woman was kind. That was the part Fern kept thinking about later, that she was kind and patient and explained everything twice, and none of it changed by a single dollar. Medicare Part A would cover the hospital stay after the deductible. Part B would cover the surgeon at 80%, which meant 20% was Fern's, and 20% of that number was not a small number. The hardware wasn't a question. The rehabilitation facility afterward was covered for a stretch of days that the woman read off a laminated sheet, and after those days ran out, it was $194 a day, and a man of 68 with that break would need considerably more days than that. The woman turned the paper around so Fern could see the total at the bottom and said, "We can set up a payment plan today." And Fern said, "I have 3 collection agencies already." And the woman looked at her for a moment and then said, quietly, "Then a plan through us won't be approved." She walked out of St. Bridget at 8 that evening and stood on the sidewalk in the cold with her hands in her coat pockets. And she did not call anybody, because there was nobody to call. Walter was upstairs on a morphine drip with a break in his hip. Daniel was 14 months in the ground. Her own mother had died when she was 19. There was a card she hadn't taken from a concierge counter, and a check she'd pushed back across a table, and another one she had torn in half. And every single one of those things had been the right thing to do, and not one of them was going to be in that room tomorrow morning when they took her father-in-law into surgery. The storefront was on Cermak, between a phone repair place and a tax office, open until 10, with a lit sign in the window that said, "Same-day funding," and another that said, "No credit needed," and she had walked past it perhaps 400 times in her life. The man behind the desk was polite. He didn't look at her belly, and he didn't ask what the money was for, and there was something almost merciful about that. He ran her information. He came back with a printed sheet, and turned it around the way the woman at the hospital had turned hers around, and put his finger on the line. 34%. Fern looked at it for a long time. "That's the rate. That's the rate for your file, ma'am. Is that legal?" "It is." He said it without any defensiveness at all, and that was the thing that got inside her, that he wasn't ashamed of it, because he had no reason to be. "The cap in Illinois is 36. We're under it. You're 2 points under it." "Yes, ma'am." He turned the page. "Now, I want to be straight with you, because some places aren't. On this amount, over the term, you'd be paying back near double what you're taking out. It's all in the box there, in the middle of the page. We're required to print it." And it was. That was the part she couldn't get past. It was printed right there, in a plain black box in the middle of the page, in a font no smaller than the rest of it. The whole terrible arithmetic of the next 4 years of her life, disclosed, compliant, legal. 2 points beneath the line the state had drawn. Nobody was cheating her. Nobody was hiding a thing. This was simply the price of being a woman with $180,000 of somebody else's dying already on her name. and the price had been set by people who had never met her and would never have to. She thought about Walter driving Daniel to that clinic and arguing with him the whole way. She thought about him sitting in the chair by the window at 1 a.m. with 2 needles in his hands, waiting up for her. She put her hand flat on her belly and held it there for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. "Where do I sign?" He showed her. 4 places, and 1 set of initials by the box. She signed all 4 and initialed the box, and her handwriting was perfectly steady, and she walked back out onto Cermak with the money in her account and a folded copy in her coat pocket, and she did not cry. Then or later that night, not once. She got to St. Bridget at 6:30 the next morning to sign the surgical consent, and the woman from Patient Financial Services was already standing at the nurse's station waiting for her, and Fern's first thought was that something had gone wrong with Walter. "Nothing's wrong," the woman said. "Mrs. Hale, your father-in-law's account was settled at 11:40 last night. In full. Settled. Paid. The surgical estimate, the hardware, the projected rehabilitation days. There's a credit balance on the file, actually. I've never seen one that size." Fern stood there with the consent form in her hand. "By who?" "It came through a law firm. There's no individual name on it." She checked her phone in the corridor with her back against the wall. There was an email from the lender on Cermak, time-stamped 12 past midnight, and it said that her contract had been paid out and voided, and that she owed nothing, and that a copy of the released note was attached for her records. She opened the attachment and looked at her own 4 signatures, and across all 4 of them, in gray, somebody had stamped the word "satisfied." She read it 3 times, and what she felt was not relief. It took her most of the walk down that corridor to understand what it was, and when she did understand, she had to stop and stand still by a window for a minute. It was the feeling of a door being opened for her from the outside, of a decision that belonged to her being lifted out of her hands overnight by somebody who had never once had to ask. She could have refused the check in the diner. She had refused it. There was nothing at all she could refuse now. It was 2 p.m. before the surgeon came out and said Walter had come through it fine, and it was 3:30 when Fern walked into the Ravello building on the river, with a copy of the released note in her coat pocket. Marble and glass, and a great deal of quiet. The 2 men behind the desk had the manner of men who had been told exactly who she was, and neither of them looked at her belly, which she noticed, because everybody looked. She was upstairs in under 4 minutes. She did not think it was a beautiful office. She thought it was a cold one. She had been in a room like that once before, a bank in the Loop where she and Daniel had sat across from a man who explained why they didn't qualify, and this room had the same weather in it, the same carpet that swallowed sound, the same feeling of a place where things were decided about people who weren't present. "You paid it." Edward turned from the desk. "Yes. All of it. The hospital, the rehab, the note." "Yes. I can't give it back." "No. That's why you did it that way." She had come up in the elevator with her whole speech built, and she found that the only thing she actually wanted to know was very small. 6 days ago you sat in a diner and you let me push an envelope back across the table. You didn't argue with me. You drank your coffee and you left. Why? Because you'd have said no. So you waited until I couldn't. "Yes." He said it without any softening at all, and she was almost grateful for that. "You'd signed at 34%, Mrs. Hale. There was a version of the next 4 years of your life sitting in a drawer on Cermak Road, and I was in a position to take it out of the drawer, and I did. If that costs me your good opinion, I've paid worse. You don't get to decide things about my life without me in the room." "No," he said. "I don't." She waited for the rest. There wasn't any rest, and that was the moment she stopped being able to read him at all. "I want to be somewhere I can hear you," he said finally. "There's a house north of the city. Your father-in-law can be moved there when they release him. There's a nurse on the property, and you'd both be behind a gate." "No. You haven't heard the terms." "There aren't terms that make me a woman who lives behind a man's gate," she said. "I've got an apartment on Emerald Street, and a shift at 11, and a baby due in 3 weeks, and I'm going home to all 3. He didn't argue. He walked her to the door himself, which she hadn't expected, and when he opened it, he said the thing that stayed with her for the next 3 days. "Somebody's watching you," he said. "It isn't my people." She turned around. "Meaning what?" "Meaning if you notice a car, or a man twice in 1 week in 2 different places, you call me, not the police." "Me? Why not the police?" "Because they'll take a report," he said, and I'll take him." 3 days later, she had her 35-week appointment at the clinic on Ashland. She was in the waiting room with a paper cup of water when she looked up at the window onto the street, and there was a man on the far sidewalk, 40 years old, or thereabouts, standing perfectly still in the cold with a phone held up at chest height, not to his ear. She watched him for 4 seconds. He lowered it and looked directly at her through the glass, and did not hurry, and did not walk away. Tobias Kern went to the Lakeshore Fertility Institute in person on a Thursday morning, because some things you don't do by telephone, and he came back to the 12th floor with almost nothing. The senior embryologist who had signed the incident memorandum was a woman named Evelyn Shaw, 52 years old, 19 years at that institute, and she had resigned on a Friday and been gone by the following Monday. No notice period. No exit interview. She had not applied for a position anywhere in the state that anybody could find. Her house in Evanston was listed with a broker who had been instructed to deal only with an attorney. Her mail was going to a box in another state that Tobias could not get a name attached to without doing something he'd have needed permission for. 19 years, he said. A woman does not walk away from 19 years and a pension on 4 days' notice because she's tired. No, sir. She wrote that memorandum. She's the one who put your name in it, and the week after she put it in writing, she disappeared. Edward stood at the window a long while. Then somebody got to her after she wrote it, he said. And not before, which tells us she wasn't in on it. It also tells us she was frightened enough to run, rather than talk to us. Yes. Edward turned around. Find her. Don't approach her. When you know where she is, you leave her alone, and you tell me. That same afternoon, in the apartment on Emerald Street, Fern came in from the pharmacy with Walter's prescriptions in a paper sack and found an envelope wedged under the door that had been hand-delivered, no postmark, heavy paper, a firm's name in the corner she had never heard of. She stood in the hall and read it twice standing up, and then she sat down on the arm of Walter's empty chair and read it a third time. It was addressed to her by name. It advised her that the firm represented an interested party, whose identity was not disclosed at this stage. It advised her that non-invasive prenatal paternity analysis was safe, established, and available in the 3rd trimester, requiring only a sample of maternal blood. It advised that her cooperation was requested voluntarily, and that the interested party was prepared to pay all associated costs. And it advised her, in a final sentence that had clearly taken somebody a while to write, that in the event she declined, the interested party reserved all rights to seek relief through the appropriate court following the birth. She read that last line perhaps 6 times. Then she put the letter face down on the table. And she sat in that quiet apartment with her hand on her belly. And the thing that came up in her was not what anybody watching would have guessed. She wasn't afraid of a court. She wasn't afraid of the man on the far sidewalk with the phone, or of Vivian Ashford, or of the family whose name was on that building by the river. What she was afraid of, sitting there in the dark with her coat still on, was a tube of her own blood in a laboratory somewhere, and a piece of paper coming back with a percentage on it, because there was almost nothing left. There was a wool cap on the arm of a chair, and a voice she was already having trouble hearing exactly right when she tried to remember it. And there was this weight under her ribs, this thing that turned over at 4 a.m, and that was the last of him in the world. Nobody had asked her permission to test that. Nobody had asked her permission for any of it. Ruth Delaney kept an office above a hardware store on Archer Avenue, 63 years old, 31 years in family law, and she took the letter from Fern's hand and read it without any expression at all. Then she took her glasses off. Who else has this? Nobody. Have you answered it? No, don't. Ruth put the letter down. There are 3 or 4 people in this city who write a paragraph like that last one, and every one of them is expensive. What do they want? They want you to volunteer, so they don't have to explain to a judge why they're entitled to ask. Ruth looked up. That tells you they're not certain they are. Can they make me? Not before the birth. After. It depends entirely on who they turn out to be, and I'm not going to guess for you. She wrote a number on a card. That's my cell. If anybody calls you, if anybody comes to the door, if anybody stops you on the street, you say the words, "I have counsel," and you hang up. That's all you ever have to say. Fern looked down at the card. I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to. Miss Delaney, I don't have anything. You've got a court date coming that you didn't ask for and a baby coming in 3 weeks. Ruth put her glasses back on. I've been doing this 31 years, Mrs. Hale. Every so often one comes through that door and I take it for nothing, and I've never once regretted the ones I took." She squared the letter on her desk. "Now, is there anybody at all who might have a reason to want to know who fathered that child?" And Fern opened her mouth to say no, and then didn't say anything at all. She rode the bus downtown at 9 the next morning with the letter in her bag, and she went up in that elevator without calling ahead, and when the doors opened she walked past Tobias Kern before he could finish saying her name. Edward was standing at the desk. She put the letter down on it. "Somebody wants my blood," she said. "Somebody with a firm in the loop, and no name on the paper, wants to know who fathered my child before he's even born. And they want it badly enough to write me a threat in the last paragraph and call it a courtesy. You've had me watched for 2 years. You paid $180,000 of somebody else's dying, and you didn't blink. There's a man photographing me through a clinic window, and every time I ask you a question you tell me I wouldn't believe you." Her voice was steady and much too loud for that room. "Say it. Whatever it is. Say it now, in words, standing there, to my face." He looked at her for a moment, and then he told her, and he told her badly, because it was the only way he knew. "The insemination you had 8 months ago at Lakeshore was not performed with your husband's material," he said. "The specimen that was thawed and used that morning was drawn from my storage account. I found out 3 days before the gala. Their attorneys notified me because my name is on the donor line, and yours is on the recipient line, and they are trying very hard to keep it out of the newspapers." The room was extremely quiet. "No," Fern said. "The identifier on the authorization didn't match the identifier on the vial. No. There are 2 independent verifications of the chain of custody, and I have both of them in the drawer under your hand. That's not—" She stopped. She started again, and her voice had gone strange. "That's not how it works. They check. They check 3 times. They showed me. There's a barcode. There's 2 people in the room. They read the name out loud. They read Daniel's name out loud to me. I heard them say it." "I know. You know." "Yes. Then say the name," she said. "Say my husband's name and tell me they were lying to me while they did it." "I don't believe they knew they were lying." Fern took a step back from the desk. She was shaking her head and she didn't seem aware of it. "You've had me watched for 2 years." "Yes." "You knew this 3 days before you walked into that ballroom." "Yes." "You knew it while you were sitting in a diner at 2 in the morning letting me push your money back across a table, like I had any idea what was happening to me." Her voice broke open on that one, and it came out of her as close to a scream as that room had ever heard. "You have known since before you ever touched me exactly what I'm carrying, and you let me stand there in that clinic hallway and thank God for the one thing I had left." "Yes." "Don't you dare. Just say yes to me. There isn't another answer." "There is." She had both hands on the edge of the desk now. "There's I'm sorry. There's I should have told you the first night. There's anything at all except standing there like a man reading me a weather report while you take the last piece of my husband off the table." Edward said nothing. And that, in the end, was the thing she couldn't stay in the room for. She picked the letter up off the desk. Her hands weren't working properly, and it took her 2 tries. "You're a liar," she said. "Fern, you're a liar, and I don't know what you want from me, and I don't care." She was already at the elevator. "Don't come to the diner. Don't come to my street. Don't pay for one more thing in my life without asking me." Tobias reached for the button and she said, "Don't touch it," and she pressed it herself, and the doors closed on Edward Ravello standing behind that desk with both hands flat on the wood, not moving. That night she didn't go into work. She let herself into the apartment, and she didn't turn on any lights. She went down the short hallway, and she opened the door of the back bedroom, the one that had been Daniel's when he was a boy, the one Walter had never changed, and she had never asked him to. There was a bed with a blue spread on it. There was a shelf with 4 trophies, for a sport he'd quit at 15. There was a window with the blind half down. Fern sat on the floor with her back against the side of that bed. The way a woman sits when standing up again is going to be difficult, and she put both hands flat on her belly, and she stayed there. The baby moved. She said, out loud, in an empty house, "They read his name." She said it 3 or 4 times, in the dark, in exactly the voice of a person trying to make an argument to somebody who has already left the room. The lab in Naperville was open on Saturdays. She went on her own, and she paid the $299 herself out of her tip envelope, because she was not going to owe that man a single thing more, and they took her blood, and told her 7 to 10 business days. It came on the 9th day, 3 pages. Fern stood in the hallway with the mail still under her arm and read the summary line at the top of the 2nd page. The child was not Daniel's. They brought Walter home on a Tuesday, on a walker, with a nurse coming twice a week, and a list of things he wasn't allowed to do that he had already begun ignoring. By Thursday evening, he was back in the chair by the window with the needles going, and it was the first ordinary hour that apartment had held in a month, and Fern stood at the sink, washing 2 plates, and listened to that small clicking sound behind her, and understood that she was about to end it. She had carried the 3 pages folded in her coat for 5 days. She had taken them out perhaps 40 times. She dried her hands. She sat down across from him. "Dad, I need you to let me get all the way to the end before you say anything." The needles stopped, she told him. She started with the letter under the door and the firm with no name on it, and then she told him what Edward Ravello had said standing behind that desk, and then she said that she hadn't believed a word of it, not one word, and that she had gone out to Naperville on her own and paid for it herself, so that nobody in this world could tell her what the answer was, except a laboratory. Then she put the 3 pages on the table and turned them around so he could see, and she put her finger on the line at the top of the 2nd page. "It isn't Daniel's," she said. Walter didn't reach for the pages. He read the line from where he sat, at that distance, with his glasses down his nose, and Fern watched his eyes go across it once. Then he sat back. The clock over the stove was the loudest thing in that apartment. Fern had rehearsed this 100 times, and in every single version he had said something, and now there was nothing at all, and she found she couldn't stop herself talking into it. They read his name out loud in that room. Dad. Both of them did. They read it off the paper, and off the vial, and I heard them. I did everything they told me to do. I signed everything they put in front of me. There wasn't 1 minute of it where I wasn't. She stopped. "I didn't know. I want you to hear me say that. I didn't know." Walter looked at his hands. Then he picked up the wool cap out of his lap, and he folded it over once, the way he always did, and he laid it on the table beside the 3 pages, very carefully, so that it sat square. He put both hands on the arms of the chair and he pushed himself up onto his feet, and it took him a long time, because of the hip, and Fern half rose to help him, and then stopped, because something in the shape of his shoulders told her not to. He got the walker under him. He crossed the room with it. It took 11 or 12 seconds, and neither of them said anything for the whole of it. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. He worked the latch with one hand, and he went out, and he pulled the door shut behind him. It didn't slam. That was the thing. It closed very softly, the way a man closes a door in a house where somebody is sleeping, and the little brass catch went home with a sound no louder than a fingernail on a table. And then the hall was quiet, and the apartment was quiet, and Fern was standing in the middle of her own kitchen alone. She stayed on her feet for a moment. Then she went down. She sat on the linoleum with her back against the cabinet door and her legs out in front of her, because there was no other way to do it at 36 weeks. And she put her face in her hands, and it came up out of her from somewhere much older than the last month. She cried the way people cry when nobody is coming, without any shape to it, until her whole body ached, and the light outside had gone from gray to nothing. At some point, the baby turned over hard under her ribs, and she put a hand there, automatically, and said, "All right, all right." She was still on that floor at 10 o'clock. He didn't come back that night. She left the chain off the door until 2 in the morning in case he did. She called him once the next day, at noon, and it rang out and went to the recording he'd never bothered to change, the one where he said Walter Hale is not available, in the loud, careful voice men his age use on machines. She didn't leave a message. She didn't call twice. She had a piece of pride left, and it was small, and it was the only thing standing between her and the floor. The second day she went to work at 11, and came home at 7, and slept 4 hours and did it again. The third day, the nurse came for the visit, and found no one home, and phoned Fern at the diner to ask where the patient was. And Fern stood by the fryer with the receiver in her hand and said, "He's with family," and did not know if that was a lie. 3 days. His chair by the window stayed empty, and the 2 needles stayed on the table where he'd left them, crossed over each other, with the wool cap folded square beside 3 pages of laboratory paper that nobody in that apartment had touched again. On the 4th morning, he came to the diner at 11 o'clock, which was not his hour, and he did not sit in the corner booth. He stood inside the door with a folder under his arm, and he said, "I'm not here to ask you for anything. I'm here because you have a right to know what was done to you, and by whom, and you can throw me out after." Fern looked at him for a long moment. Then she told the cook she was taking her 15. They sat in the back booth by the kitchen door where the fryer noise covered everything. He opened the folder and turned it around so it faced her, and he did not touch it again after that. And she noticed that he kept his hands off it while she read. The first page was a transfer authorization from Lakeshore, dated 8 months earlier. There was a signature at the bottom. Who is that? A laboratory technician. 29 years old, 4 years at that institute, resigned 6 weeks after your procedure. And, Edward turned the next page for her. It was a bank record. 2 payments, 4 months apart, from a limited liability company registered in Delaware with a registered agent's address in Wilmington and no employees. Behind it was another page, and behind that another, 4 shelves deep, each one owning the next. And on the final page, there was a management agreement with a real name printed at the bottom in a real corporate typeface. Ashford Holdings. Fern didn't say anything for a while. She turned back 2 pages and looked at the technician's signature again. "Why?" she said, and Edward Ravello told her, once, plainly, and never spoke of it again after that day. His father had left the legitimate holdings of that family in a trust, a little over $1.2 billion, and had written it the way a suspicious old man writes things. Edward held control of it only so long as he stayed out of a felony conviction. If he was convicted, control passed to the guardian of the estate of his nearest blood descendant, appointed by a court, to be held until that child reached majority. His father had meant it as a leash. He had wanted his son to have too much to lose. There was no descendant, Edward said. For 37 years there was no descendant, so there was no leash and no second door into that trust. Somebody read that instrument and understood that the only thing standing between him and $1.2 billion was a child that didn't exist. So he made one. Fern put both hands flat on the table. "Then it's 3 moves, she said slowly. "Make the child, put you in a federal courtroom, then walk in and ask a judge to let him mind the money for the baby." "Yes." "How long has he been on the second move?" 9 months, that we can see. Possibly longer." She sat with that. Then she said the thing she had been circling since the first page. "Why me?" "You want the honest answer." "I want the answer, because you were the safest file in that clinic." He said it without any softening. A widow using her deceased husband's material. There is no living man anywhere on the earth who would ever look at that child and wonder. Your husband's parents are one man of 68 who buried his son. You have no mother, no father, no brother, no sister. You are $180,000 in medical debt sold to 3 agencies. And a woman in that position does not hire attorneys and does not go to newspapers because she cannot afford the time off. He stopped. There were 411 patients cycled through that institute in the month you were treated. You were chosen out of all of them for exactly the reasons that have made your life hard. The friar hissed behind the wall. Somebody rang the bell at the counter, and neither of them turned. "Say that last part again," Fern said. "You were chosen because you were poor." "No," she shook her head slowly. "Say it the other way." He looked at 411 women, and he picked the one nobody would come looking for. Edward didn't answer, which was an answer. Fern looked down at the folder and turned it back to the first page, to the transfer authorization with the technician's signature at the bottom, and she looked at that piece of paper for a long time. "So from the beginning," she said, "my body was just somebody else's safe." She said it quietly, without heat, and it landed in that booth harder than anything she had shouted at him in that office downtown. "That's what I was. Not a mother, not a widow, not a woman who sat in a clinic room 8 months ago and made the only decision that was ever fully mine. A place to keep his key. Yes. And you knew that 3 days before the gala. I knew the specimen was mine. I didn't know whose hand was on it until 11 days ago." Fern pushed the folder back across the table toward him, and then stopped halfway, and left it sitting there between them. "My father-in-law hasn't been home in 4 days, she said. Edward Ravello said nothing to that either, but something in his face changed, and it was the first thing she had ever seen there that she could read. She left the next morning without telling anybody, and she did it the way a woman does when she has finally understood that every person who knows where she is has some use for her being there. She took the Rock Island line out of LaSalle Street and got off at Joliet because it was the last stop and because she had $41 in her coat and a motel there took cash. Room 11. A bed, a chair, a television bolted to the dresser, and a window that looked out on the parking lot and the highway beyond it. She paid for 3 nights. She did not tell the diner. She did not call Ruth Delaney. She turned her phone off on the first evening and did not turn it on again. And she lay on that bed in her coat with her hands on her belly and let the trucks go by out on the interstate. And for the first time in 5 weeks, nobody on earth was watching her, or paying for her, or deciding things about her in a room she wasn't in. On the 3rd night, the snow came. It began a little after 8, small and dry at first, and by 10 it was falling in a way that people who grew up in that part of the country recognize immediately, straight down and thick, and without any wind behind it at all, so that the whole parking lot went white and soft and silent. The sound of the highway went from a roar to a hush, and the light from the office sign came through it in a slow orange grain, like something falling through water. Fern sat in the chair by the window and watched it for 2 hours without turning the television on. It was the quietest she had been since the night of the gala. Headlights came off the frontage road at 11:20. One car. It came in slow, and it parked crooked, because the lines were long since buried, and it sat there a moment with the wipers going before the engine shut off. A man got out on the driver's side, and there was nobody else in that car. He was in a dark overcoat with no hat and no gloves, and he stood for a second getting his bearings, and then he came along the row of doors and stopped at 11. He didn't knock right away. When he did, it was twice, not hard. Fern opened it with the chain on. Edward Ravello stood in the falling snow with his shoulders already gone white and looked at her through the gap. 3 nights, he said. How did you find me? You paid cash and you didn't leave the county. There aren't very many places. Who's with you? No one. There's always someone with you. Not tonight. She looked past him at the car. It was true. She shut the door and slid the chain and opened it again. But she didn't step back and she didn't ask him in. And he didn't try to come in. And the two of them stood there in the doorway with the cold pouring past them into the room. Say what you came to say. I'm not here for the baby. She hadn't known she was braced for it until he said it. Something went out of her shoulders. That's what you drove out here for. It's the only sentence that mattered. He had snow in his hair and he didn't appear to notice. You've had a man photographing you, and a firm with no name threatening you, and a folder full of my family's business put in front of you in a diner booth. Somebody was always going to come out here after you, and I wanted to be the one who came so that when I said it, you'd hear it from me and not from a lawyer. I'm not here to take anything from you. Not now and not after he's born. And what do you want? I want you not to be alone in a motel room at 36 weeks with the phone off, he said. That's the whole of it. Fern looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached back for her bag off the bed. He carried it. She let him. The road back was slow, 35 miles an hour most of the way with the wipers laboring, and neither of them said anything for the first 20 minutes. Then Fern watched the snow come at the windshield and said, without turning her head, there was a man behind the diner on Halstead, about 2 years ago, in the rain. Edward kept his eyes on the road. There was. I gave him a towel and stayed with him till his people came. I never told a soul, not even Daniel. She waited. Was that you? Yes. That was all he said, and he didn't add anything to it. And Fern turned and looked at the side of his face for a long time with the wipers going. She turned back to the windshield. You could have told me the first night in the lobby, she said. You'd have thought I was collecting on it. I'd have thought you were owed something. Exactly. They came into the city a little after 1. He pulled up outside the building on Emerald Street and put it in park and did not shut the engine off, and Fern sat there a moment with her hand on the door. There was a light on in the second-floor window. She hadn't left one on. The light in the window was the nurse. She had come for the Thursday visit, found nobody home for the second time, and let herself in with the key Walter had given her in December, and she was sitting on the arm of that empty chair with her coat still on when Fern came through the door at 1:30 in the morning. Walter had not come back. That was Wednesday. On Friday, the process server found Fern at the diner, at the counter, in front of 6 customers, and did it properly and quietly and left. Ruth Delaney read the complaint in her office above the hardware store on Archer Avenue with her glasses down her nose and did not speak for 4 full minutes. It was a civil action. It alleged that Fern Hale had entered into a private, compensated gestational arrangement, that she had accepted payment for it, that she had subsequently repudiated the arrangement, and attempted to conceal the child's paternity for financial advantage. Attached were exhibits: a retainer agreement with her name typed on the signature line, and a signature under it that Fern had never made. A schedule of 4 cash payments, a carbon of a receipt with an initial on it, a handwritten note on a torn half-sheet in a hand not unlike hers. "That isn't my signature. I know it isn't." "Then it's over in a day. They compare it to my driver's license. They compare it to the loan papers I signed on Cermak. And it's over in a day." "It isn't over in a day," Ruth said. "It's over in about 11 months. And every one of those months it sits on a public docket in this county where any reporter with a library card can read it." "That's what it's for, Mrs. Hale. It was never meant to be one." Fern stared at the pages. They filed a lie on purpose. They filed a headline on purpose. The headline came Saturday morning. Vivian Ashford sat in a television studio on Michigan Avenue at 7:40 in the morning and did it in 11 minutes. And she did it well, which was the worst part of it. She didn't shout. She didn't call Fern a single name that could be pulled out and printed on its own. She said the word alleged 4 times. She said that her family had extended a private financial courtesy to a woman in distress and had asked nothing in return and had been repaid with a public spectacle. She said that a video that had made a great many people very emotional had, in her view, been a great deal more arranged than anyone realized. She said she hoped the courts would sort it out, and she said she felt sorry for the child. And when the host asked whether she believed the pregnant waitress had targeted Edward Ravello deliberately, Vivian Ashford paused for exactly the right length of time and said, "I think we should let the filing speak." By 11 that morning, the clip of that pause had 200,000 views on its own. The turn was fast, and it was ugly, and it was almost entirely from people who had been on her side 11 days earlier. Fern's face went back up on the same sites that had put it up the first time, with a different sentence under it. The comment sections that had been full of "God bless that young woman" filled up instead with the same 4 or 5 ideas repeated by strangers who typed them with total confidence. She read none of it after the first hour. She didn't have to, because the diner did it for her. A man at the counter asked her, in front of everyone, how much she'd got for it. A woman took a photograph of her from a booth without pretending otherwise. On Sunday, somebody called the restaurant 11 times between 2 and 4 in the morning, and hung up each time the manager answered. On Monday, the manager who had put her on the schedule when nobody else in Chicago would touch her stood by the register with his hands in his apron pockets and said, "Fern, I've got no problem with you, but I've got 40 seats and 11 of them were full all weekend." And she said, "I know." And she untied her apron there and then and did not make him finish the sentence. On Tuesday, she came home from the pharmacy and found the notice taped to the door of the second-floor apartment on Emerald Street. 7 days. Her lease was a month-to-month arrangement she had signed with a management company 4 years earlier, when Daniel was still standing in that hallway holding the pen. And month-to-month meant 7 days meant 7 days. She called the number on the notice and got a young man who was reading from something, and who told her twice that this was not a personal matter and that the owner was within his rights. And when she asked whether the building had been sold, he said he wasn't able to discuss ownership questions over the phone. Fern hung up and stood in the middle of that apartment. Walter's chair was empty, and the needles were still crossed on the table where he'd left them 11 days before. And she was 36 weeks and 4 days pregnant, out of work, 7 days from the street, publicly accused of selling her own child. And the only man in Chicago who could have stopped any of it was the one man whose help she had spent 5 weeks refusing to take. It started at 9:20 that night, and she knew what it was on the second one, and she stood in the kitchen with one hand on the counter and counted, and when the third came, she went and got her coat. The storm had shut the city down by 7. There were no cabs on Emerald Street, and the buses were running an hour behind on a good night, and this was not a good night. She called the number on the card Ruth Delaney had given her, and it rang out. She stood in that hallway for 11 seconds with the phone in her hand. Then she scrolled down to the number she had put in 6 weeks earlier and never once used, and she pressed it. And he answered on the first ring. And all she said was, "It's early." And he said, "Don't move," and hung up. He was outside in 19 minutes, which she later worked out was not possible at the speed anybody sane would have driven that night. No car service, no men. He came up the stairs himself and took the bag out of her hand and went down in front of her, 1 step at a time, with his hand out behind him the entire way. St. Bridget was 4.5 miles. It took them 50 minutes. The wipers couldn't keep up, and he drove with his shoulders forward and his hands at the top of the wheel, and did not once tell her that everything was going to be fine, which she was grateful for in a way she couldn't have explained. Twice she gripped the door handle and made a sound she didn't recognize as her own, and both times he said only, "We're 4 minutes out, we're 2 minutes out," in the same voice he used for everything, and it was the flatness of it that kept her from coming apart. At the emergency entrance, 2 people came out with a chair. He handed over her bag. He said her name once, and then, "Go," and he did not follow her through those doors, and he did not ask anybody a single question. He stayed in the waiting room of that hospital for 6 hours in a wet overcoat, and he did not put his hands on any of it. Elias came at 19 minutes past 2 in the morning. 4 pounds, 6 ounces. He didn't cry the way the ones on television cry. There was a small, thin sound, once, and then a great deal of very calm and very fast movement by people who did not raise their voices at all, and Fern lay there listening to a language she didn't speak being spoken quickly over her son, and she heard somebody say 35 and 1 and somebody else say pink up. And then a woman was beside her head saying, "He's breathing. He's small and he's early and he's breathing. We're going to take him upstairs now." She got about 4 seconds. They brought him past her wrapped, and she turned her head and saw a face the size of her palm, eyes shut, one hand out of the blanket with the fingers spread. Then he was gone through a door. They wheeled her up at 20 past 4. The neonatal floor was quiet in a particular way. The hush of a room where the loudest sounds are machines counting. A soft chirp, then another, then a pause, then a chirp from a different corner. There were 6 isolettes. His was the 3rd one. Fern got out of the chair and stood in front of the clear plastic wall and looked at her son. He was on his back with a knit cap swallowing his head, and a strip of tape on his cheek holding a line at his nose, and a monitor lead on his chest that rose and fell, rose and fell. His whole leg was the length of her thumb. He was 2 days short of 5 weeks early, and he had been alive for 2 hours, and there was a hole in the side of that box with a padded sleeve in it, and a nurse said, "You can put your hand in." And Fern said, "I might hurt him." "You won't." She put her hand through. She did not touch him for a long moment. Then she put one finger against the sole of his foot, and the foot pressed back, and Fern Hale stood in a room full of quiet machines at 4:30 in the morning, and did not make a sound, and the tears went down her face and off her chin onto the top of that box, and she left her hand in there for 11 minutes, until a nurse gently said, "Mom, you need to sit." She slept in the chair. She woke at 10 to 3 the following night with her neck locked and the chirping going, and a nurse standing beside her with a clipboard held against her chest. "Mrs. Hale. Is he?" "He's fine. He's fine. Nothing's changed." The nurse crouched down to be level with her, the way they teach them to. "Somebody's downstairs at the desk asking to come up. Security won't let anyone onto this floor unless they're on the family list, so I've come to check with you first." Fern sat up slowly. "They're on it," the nurse said. "That's why I'm asking." Fern had never put a single name on that list. It took him a long time to come down that corridor. She heard him before she saw him, the walker, the particular double sound of it, set and step, set and step. And Fern stood up out of the chair and put a hand on the back of it and waited. Walter Hale came through the doors of that unit at 3 in the morning in his good coat, the one he wore to funerals and to church, with snow melting on the shoulders of it. He didn't look at her first. He went past her, slowly, to the 3rd isolette, and he stopped in front of the clear plastic wall, and he looked down at the baby inside, and then he didn't move at all. He stood there for a very long time. The machines chirped in their corners. A nurse came in on soft shoes, looked at the 2 of them, and went out again. Fern didn't say anything. She had spent 11 days building sentences for this, and every one of them had gone out of her head the moment she heard that walker in the hall. 4 pounds, he said at last. 4 pounds, 6 ounces. That's a fighter. He kept looking down through the plastic. You were 7.5. Daniel told me that once. He was proud of it, like he'd done it himself. Dad, let me get it out. He said it quietly. I've been sitting in my sister's spare room in Cicero for 11 days, working out how to say this, and I've made a poor job of it every single time, so I'm going to say it badly and you're going to let me. Fern went still. I didn't leave your apartment because of what that paper said about the baby, he said. I left because of what it made me have to tell you. He shifted his weight on the walker. 25 years ago, I brought a boy home from a placement office on Ogden Avenue. He was 4 years and 2 months old. He'd been in 3 houses already, and he wouldn't let anybody touch the back of his neck, And he didn't talk for the first 6 weeks. He was under my roof. Ellen and I signed the final papers in a courthouse downtown 11 months later, and we drove home, and we never said one word about it to him or to anybody else for the rest of our lives. Fern's hand came off the back of the chair. Daniel. Walter still hadn't looked up from the box. Ellen wanted to tell him when he turned 18. Then she got sick, and it didn't get told. And then she was gone, and I was the only one left who knew, and there's no good day to hand a young man a thing like that. So I kept finding reasons, and 1 year turned into 10. And then he was 30, and he was sick, and I wasn't going to do it to him then. His voice went rough for the first time, so he died not knowing. And that's mine. I carry that. Dad, I know you never. That's not what I'm telling you. He turned his head then, and looked at her, and his eyes were wet and perfectly steady. You sat at my table, and you put 3 pages in front of me, and you said the words, "It isn't Daniel's," and you were watching my face to see if I was going to stop calling that baby my grandson. That's what you were watching for. Don't tell me you weren't. She couldn't answer him, and I couldn't say a word, because there was a thing I'd never told you sitting right there in my mouth, and I'd been keeping it for 25 years, and I was ashamed. He looked back down at the isolette, so I got up and I walked out of my own son's house and left you on that kitchen floor. 11 days. I had to live with every hour of them. Fern had both hands over her mouth. I never shared 1 drop of blood with that boy, Walter said, and there isn't a soul on this earth who'd have dared tell me I wasn't his father. Nobody spoke for a while. Somewhere behind them a monitor changed its note and then went back. The first night I had him, he said, he wouldn't sleep in the bed. He slept on the floor next to it, and I sat in the doorway till 4 in the morning like a fool, and around about 3 he put his hand out into the hallway. Didn't say anything, just put his hand out. Walter breathed in. He wasn't mine for 11 more months, legally speaking. He was mine at 3 in the morning. He reached inside his coat then, and took out the wool cap, finished, the loose ends worked in, and he held it a moment in his big hand. Then he leaned over and set it on top of that clear plastic box, square, the way he set everything. It's too big for him yet, he said. He'll grow. Fern came across the room and put her arms around her father-in-law over the top of the walker, and neither of them said anything at all. Behind them, in the third isolette, the baby turned his head a 1/4 inch toward the sound. Elias was 9 days old and still in that unit when Harlan Ashford made both of his moves inside the same week. And he made them the way a man does who has been drafting them for a year. The first was filed in the probate division of the Circuit Court of Cook County on a Monday afternoon, a petition for appointment of a guardian of the estate of a minor. It did not ask for the child. Ruth Delaney was careful to say that out loud twice in her office so that Fern would hear it properly. Nobody was coming to any hospital for that baby. What the petition asked was that a court find the mother unfit to manage the property interests of her son, and it made that case in 11 pages, and every page of it was made out of her own life. It listed the medical debt sold to 3 agencies. It listed the loan she had signed on Cermak at 34%, and noted that she had signed it 11 days before the birth. It listed her termination from the catering company, and her termination from the diner, and the 7-day notice on the apartment. It listed the pending civil action, alleging she had sold her own pregnancy, and it cited that action, as though it were a finding, rather than a filing. And in a paragraph near the end it observed that the mother was, at the date of the petition, unhoused, unemployed, and represented by pro bono counsel. Every single thing in there is true, Fern said. Every single thing in there was done to you, Ruth said. That's a different document, and it's the one we're going to write. The second move landed the same week, in a building on Dearborn Street. Somebody delivered a great deal of paper to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, and it was good paper, sourced and indexed and cross-referenced. 7 years of it, and every page of it concerned the Ravello family. Tobias Kern came into the office on the 12th floor at 8 in the morning with 2 things. The first was a copy of that index, obtained the way such things get obtained. He set it down. The second he took out of his coat and laid on the desk beside it, and then he stepped back 1 pace and stood with his hands at his sides. It sat there on the wood between the 2 of them. He's 61 years old and he goes to a club on Walton Street 4 mornings a week, Tobias said. It's a 20-minute matter. He's been asking for it for a year, and there isn't a man in this city who'd wonder. Edward looked at it for a moment. Then he put 2 fingers on it and pushed it back across the desk, slowly, the whole width of the wood, until it was in front of Tobias again. "No. Sir, pick it up." Tobias picked it up and put it away, and there was a long silence in that room, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. "Then they'll have you in a federal courtroom by summer. Yes. You understand what that costs you. I understand exactly what it costs me." Edward stood and went to the window. 27 years you've worked for this family, so you'll know I'm not saying this to be admired. If I do what you've just put on my desk, then I keep the trust, and I keep the building, and I keep every one of those 7 years off the record, and in 18 years' time, a young man reads about his father in a newspaper archive and finds out what was done in the month he was born. He turned around. There is a folder in that drawer with a technician's signature in it. A man looked at 411 women and picked the one nobody would come looking for, because she was poor and she was alone and her husband was dead. That's the world I inherited. That's the world I've been operating in and doing well in for 19 years. Sir, I don't want my son inheriting what I inherited. Tobias didn't answer. Edward went back to the desk and sat down and pulled a legal pad toward him. "Call Gans. Tell him I want a proffer. Everything from the Ashford side, all 7 years, the joint ventures, the land trusts, the 3 parcels on the South Branch, all of it, and I'm not asking for immunity on my own conduct in those transactions." He wrote for a moment. "Tell him I'll sit down with them for as long as they want me for. They'll take the trust. They'll take the trust. They may take considerably more than the trust. Then they'll take it," Edward said, "and the boy grows up with a mother who owns a business and a grandfather who knits, and the worst thing anybody can ever tell him about me is that I stood up in a courtroom and said what I'd done out loud." 9 days later, on a Tuesday morning, a woman walked into the reception area of the United States Attorney's office on Dearborn Street with a lawyer beside her and asked to speak with someone about the Lakeshore Fertility Institute. Evelyn Shaw was 52 years old, and she had been living in a rented house in Michigan for 4 months. She had come back on her own. She gave them the transfer authorization and the internal audit trail she had preserved before she resigned, and then she put a small recorder on the table and told them the date on which 2 men had come to see her, and what they had offered her, and what they had said would happen if she went to anybody. And she said, "I've been quiet for 8 months, and I'm not going to be quiet for the rest of it." Vivian Ashford walked into the Dirksen Federal Building on a Thursday morning in April, with her own attorney and a thumb drive, and she did not tell her father she was going. What she handed over was 11 months of email between Harlan Ashford and 2 men who had never once been employed by anything with his name on it, and one message in particular, sent 14 months before the gala, in which her father had written a single sentence about a list of patients at a fertility institute and the kind of woman who would be least likely to ask questions. Her lawyer asked her, on the record, whether she understood she was providing evidence against her own father. Vivian said she understood. Then she said the thing that ended up quoted in every account of that case, and she said it quietly, without any performance in it at all. "I'm not betraying my father. My father is the one who sold a child before that child was ever born." The indictment came down in June. Wire fraud, healthcare fraud, falsification of medical records, conspiracy, 11 counts in total, and the man who had cut a ribbon in front of 200 people in a hotel ballroom stood in a federal courtroom in his good suit and heard them read out one by one. The civil action against Fern was dismissed with prejudice in July. The probate petition was withdrawn 11 days after that, because there was no longer anybody willing to sign their name to it. The judge in the probate division read the withdrawal into the record and then did something she was not obliged to do, which was to look up and address the young woman sitting at the far table with a car seat on the chair beside her, and ask whether she wished to say anything. Fern Hale stood up. "I've cleaned tables since I was 19 years old, she said. "I have carried other people's dinners to them, and I have picked up what they dropped. And I want to say that there is nothing in that work that a person should ever have to apologize for. A man read 411 names, and he chose mine, and he chose it because I was poor, because my husband was dead, because I owed money to a hospital, and because he was certain that a woman in a uniform has nobody standing behind her. That was his whole plan. That was all of it. He was wrong. And I want the record to show why he was wrong. My father-in-law came. A doctor drove back from another state to sit in a room and tell the truth when she had every reason to stay quiet. A daughter walked into a federal building carrying her father's own words. Not one of those people did it for money, and not one of them did it where anybody could see. So I would like whoever reads this transcript someday to understand something. You cannot tell what a person is worth by looking at what they're wearing while they work. My son is 9 months old. He is going to grow up knowing that. She sat down. In September, a woman of about 70 came into the little breakfast place Fern had opened on a corner in Bridgeport, and stood inside the door a long moment before she came to the counter. She said she had been at a table at that gala. She said she hadn't laughed, but she hadn't stood up either, and that she had thought about it nearly every day for a year and a half, and that she was sorry. Fern came around the counter and took her hands. "There's coffee on," she said. "Sit anywhere you like." A year on from the night of the storm, that place opened at 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. Walter Hale had a chair by the front window that everybody knew not to sit in, and he held his grandson in it most mornings while the first orders went out. The boy's name was Elias. It had been Edward's suggestion, offered once, with the understanding that Fern would decide, and she had turned it over for 2 days before she said yes, because it had belonged to no one in either of their families, and that was the point. There was no trust anymore. There was no building on the river. Edward Ravello had spent 11 months in proffer sessions, and had come out the other side with far less than he went in with, and with his name still his own, and on Tuesday mornings he wiped down tables in a breakfast place in Bridgeport, because the woman who owned it was short-handed on Tuesdays. On the anniversary of the storm, she found him doing exactly that, at 9:30, with the last of the morning rush gone, and Walter asleep in the window chair with the baby on his shoulder. She took the cloth out of his hand and set it on the table. Then she reached up and kissed him, and it was the first time in their lives that she was the one who crossed the distance. Here is what that year taught the people in it. A human being's worth is not printed on their uniform, and it is not held in their bank account, and any world that says otherwise is simply telling you what it intends to do to you. Blood does not make a father. Choosing does. And the truest measure of any of us is what we do for a stranger at 2 in the morning, when there is no camera, no audience, and nothing at all to be gained by it. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the ones we bring you every day, and take a moment to like and share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. We would truly love to know what this story stirred in you, so tell us in the comments. Has there been a time in your own life when someone looked past what you were wearing and saw who you really are? Or a moment when you were the one who chose to stand up? We read every word you write, and we are always moved by what you share with us from the heart. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you good health, peace, and a great deal of quiet joy in your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.